Welcome. I am Jeremy Melvin, the president of the board of the Sargent House Museum, and it's a pleasure to have all of you with us for tonight's presentation, an evening with Katherine Sherbooke, here to talk about her new novel, Leaving Coy's Hill, about the life of early feminist and advocate for women's rights, Lucy Stone. The Sargent House Museum is in Gloucester, Massachusetts, for those of you who are not familiar with us. And we are a historic house focused primarily on the life and works of Judith Sargent Murray, who built this house with her husband and lived here for many years. And she was also an early feminist and advocate for women's rights. And so it's an appropriate presentation we're having here tonight. And it's with real pleasure we have you here because this evening, although the pandemic has been challenging for many of us, events like this evening have been one of the fruits of that time as we, as a museum, have had to be creative and come up with new ways to offer programming. And one of the results has been this series of online presentations and conversations that we've had. The house itself, though, is still open. We're open through Columbus Day weekend, Saturdays and Sundays from 12 to 4. And so if you are able, we encourage you to come and visit us. We have still our art exhibit, The Nurse Project, by local artist Vanessa Mihalek, that has been extended through Columbus Day weekend. And so we encourage you, if you're able, to come tour the house and take a look at that exhibit. And we will be offering outdoor walking tours this fall, as we did this past spring. And so I encourage you to look at our website for more information about that. It's not posted yet, but information about that will be coming soon. So again, thank you for joining us, and it is my pleasure to leave you now with Katherine Sherbooke.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here. Thank you to the Sargent House for having me for this series called Lost Voices, which is so appropriate for Lucy Stone. As was said, I'm here to talk to you about my book, Leaving Coy's Hill, which is inspired by the life of Lucy Stone, who was an abolitionist and a pioneering feminist, as you've heard. So what I'd like to do as we begin the talk is just share a few slides with you. I have some visuals that I think can help ground us in Lucy's time period and also give you a sense of the book. So I'm going to walk through that fairly quickly, and then I'll come back on screen and talk a little bit more about sort of the uncanny similarities between Lucy Stone and Judith Sargent Murray, in whose house I am currently speaking to you from. So first of all, Lucy Stone is a woman who I would like to admit straight up front, I had never heard about until I stumbled upon her. Even though she was quite a well-known figure in her time, she has fallen out of popular cultural history. And that's a big part of my book, and we'll talk about that. But one of the first questions I often get is, how did I find her? And I stumbled upon her because of a statue on Commonwealth Ave in Boston. This is called the Boston Women's Memorial. And it was dedicated in 2003 and features what the organizers of this memorial call the 3 women who were essential to Boston's history. So it features Abigail Adams, who we all know as the wife of John Adams. It also features, she's in the back. The statue on the right is of Phyllis Wheatley, who was the first African-American poet ever to be published. She actually came to Boston as a slave and ended up being educated in Cambridge. And the figure on the left is Lucy Stone. I'll give you a closer look of Lucy. Here she is. And I can't resist, friends of mine are so great. They bring my book and take pictures of Lucy. So that's the one on the left. And I visit her as often as I can. So that's me, Lucy there on the right. But as I said, I'd never heard of her. And so the very few things that I immediately learned, I found quite surprising, given that I hadn't heard of her before. Namely, that she was the first woman in Massachusetts to earn a college degree. She was the first woman ever to speak out publicly on women's rights. And she was the first woman on record in our country to keep her maiden name. So I thought, how is this possible that I have not heard of this woman? And I immediately wanted to know more and began to research her. So if you're thinking, okay, women's rights, 1800s, mid 1800s is the time period we're talking about, you immediately think suffrage. You would be right, yes. Suffrage is one of the key things that Lucy Stone fought for, but in her time, that wasn't even close to the radar. So Lucy Stone was born in 1818 in West Brookfield, Massachusetts. And this was at a time when girls were not regularly educated past the 8th grade. It was considered scandalous for women to speak in mixed company, meaning if men and women were together. She grew up on a working farm, a hardworking farm, and she grew up under a staunch abolitionist. So her father was dead against slavery, and he felt it important to fight for abolition. I also learned in my research that that was unusual even in the North at the time. So he was considered a bit of an outlier. We're talking now, let's say 1830 or so, when he became very vocal at home about the need for abolition. So Lucy grew up under a fighter and understanding that she needed to fight for what was right. She also learned at a very young age, she came to understand how few rights women had in our country, specifically married women. So I'd like to show you just a couple of illustrations that talk about two of kind of the clearest examples of lack of women's rights. So the illustration you see on your left is an illustration of Blackstone's law. This is a law that came over to us from England, which stated that it was legal for a husband to beat his wife with an instrument of reasonable size. So domestic abuse was in fact legal. So the men had all the physical power in the house. And then there was a law called coverture. And the illustration to the right of your screen demonstrates what that is about, which said that once a woman marries, she gives up everything to her husband. So all of her property, any income she might earn, even any future children, are the full and complete property of the husband. So what this illustration shows, and you know, this did not vary by class, because you see here a very well-dressed man in his tails, basically saying to his wife, you know, what can I do about it? You're bound, literally bound in this illustration, by marriage. And so everything that is yours is mine by right. So Lucy understands all this by about the age of 12, and she vows to her mother that she will never marry because she wants to stay independent. Now, interestingly, she doesn't make this proclamation at 12 years old because she's already decided she wants to fight for women's rights. She makes this proclamation because she wants to maintain her independence so that she can fight for the cause of abolition. So Lucy does in fact go on to start a career in working for the Anti-Slavery Society of New England and of Massachusetts. She puts herself through college to do this because she believes that she really needs to be better educated. She convinces the faculty of Oberlin to let her study rhetoric, which was considered absurd at the time. As I mentioned, it was considered scandalous for women to speak in public. So teaching a woman rhetoric was, you know, either a waste of time or encouraging sordid behavior. But she talks her way into these classes and she ends up getting a job with the Anti-Slavery Society. And these images here, by the way, that I find are very interesting. The two with all the people in them are an actual protest that took place in Faneuil Hall when an escaped slave was captured and brought to trial in Boston and returned back to the South. The Liberator was a very important anti-slavery paper that was founded by William Lloyd Garrison, which Lucy Stone's father read by the fireplace to them every night. But so Lucy gets hired by the Anti-Slavery Society, which was hugely exciting for her. And she ends up speaking alongside her idols. So William Lloyd Garrison, who I just mentioned, Lower left is Samuel May, who was the president of the New England Anti-Slavery Society, Frederick Douglass, who was the lion of his time, master orator, and of course escaped slave, and Abby Kelly, who was an incredibly important figure for Lucy Stone. Abby Kelly had also chosen as a woman to speak out on the cause of abolition, and in fact came to Lucy's hometown, and Lucy was able to see her speak, and it changed Lucy's life because she thought, oh, if there's another woman out there who can do this, I can do this too. Never did she expect that she might be sharing a stage with Abby Kelly and speaking right alongside her. So Lucy, in this job of hers, she is traveling by herself in cities, in small towns, speaking 6 to 7 days a week on the cause of abolition. And again, this was big news. There were people who would come in droves to hear her speak just to find out what a hard creature might look like. Like, what kind of woman is going to stand on stage and speak to us? She must be horrific. And they were always surprised to find a very demure woman. Lucy was a small woman, and she was known to have an extraordinary voice. So they say that she sort of mesmerized them into silence because she was not only a great orator, but had this power coming out of this very small and feminine form. So she goes on speaking about abolition, and then one day she sees something that changes everything for her. This is called the Greek slave, which was a statue that was at the time on a tour through the Americas. And it was quite controversial because it was the first full-size female nude ever to be exhibited in the States. And it was in Boston at the time. So Lucy's on her way to a very important speech, and she stops by to see the statue for herself. And standing in front of it, she suddenly was overcome by the understanding that this woman, as pious and demure as she looks, was a slave. And she realizes that as much as she's talking about Negroes, as they were called at the time, being enchained, that women were enchained in their own homes. And while she never gives up the cause of abolition, she realizes on that day that she can no longer devote all of her energy and all of her oratory powers in speaking without also speaking on the cause of women's rights. So she decides that she's going to do this, which no one in the country has ever done before, gone around and stood on a stage and spoken about women's rights. But she does it, and she becomes quite famous for it. She was making a name for herself because she was speaking on abolition, but now all of a sudden there's this woman speaking on women's rights, and everybody knew her name. Every paper wrote about her. People would come in even larger crowds, again, to see what this was all about. And this is an illustration of her on stage and what she had to put up with. She had tomatoes thrown at her. She had Bibles thrown at her. She even had hoses turned on her, which you can see in this illustration. But she just kept on. She was fearless and determined that this was the work of her life. And so she continues to speak a couple of days a week for abolition and about 5 days a week for women's rights. Now, of course, Lucy doesn't take this fight on her own for long. There were other women who were agitating, as they say, in many ways. Susan B. Anthony comes on the scene because of Lucy Stone. One of Lucy's speeches inspires Susan B. Anthony to join the movement. And Lucy and Susan B. Anthony, alongside Elizabeth Cady Stanton, really become the trio that run the women's movement. So they organize conventions, they write essays, they write petitions. This illustration shows you a petition for universal suffrage signed by the three of them, which what they would do was mail these petitions to any supporters they could think of and amass thousands of signatures and then present their petitions to Congress, which is what this petition was about. Now, they had incredible headwinds in their face, as I'm sure you all know, with regard to suffrage. These are just a couple of illustrations I want to show you, which give a sense of how fierce the propaganda was against suffrage. So the one on the left says, what would I do with suffragists? You know, literally lock their jaws shut and tie them up. There was just, people had no qualms about saying that. The illustration to your right is both humorous and really frightening. The other going kind of statement or fear mongering was, if women get the right to vote, if they're actually let out of the domestic sphere at all, you know, the men are going to be stuck home forever with babies. Like, who's going to do the laundry? Who's going to make dinner? Who's going to wash our children's faces? And this says, you know, to our absent friends, you know, this poor sot will never be able to go back to the pub if his wife is allowed to vote. So, you know, the propaganda was strong, and it took, obviously, it was an extremely long fight. So my book, Leaving Coy's Hill, and again, it's fiction, so it's told from the first person point of view of Lucy Stone, because I really want to imagine what it might feel like to be her. But it focuses on two storylines. So the first is her career. So this career of abolition and then speaking out on women's rights, what that was like. And very importantly, her friendship with Susan B. Anthony, and then a rift that causes a great falling out between them, which is why Lucy Stone is no longer a popular name. She was essentially and quite purposefully written out of history by Susan B. Anthony. So to know more about why, you'll have to read the book. And then the other storyline is actually a bit of a love story. So here is Lucy Stone, who has made her career speaking on the perils of marriage above all else, that women will lose their rights if they get married, and upturns this young, strapping gentleman named Henry Blackwell, who proposes a marriage of equals. Now, you may know the Blackwell name. It's quite a famous family, really made famous by Elizabeth Blackwell, who was his sister, who was the first woman to be licensed as a doctor in our country. So he was really brought up to believe women could be equal. And he says to Lucy, wouldn't your message be more compelling if you weren't an unmarried woman, but if you were actually married? And you could say to your listeners, look, it's possible. You can be married and have a career. How about it? So this is extraordinarily revolutionary idea, very interesting to Lucy. But as you can imagine, the law has not changed. So the truth of the matter is, if she decides to take him up, very unusual offer, she would still have to technically give up everything that is hers, all her income from speaking, her even choice to decide when she's going to go on the road, when she's not, would technically be his. So she really struggles with what to do about that. And so the book investigates those choices, personal versus professional, what compromises are worth making. Is a marriage of equals even possible, even outside the law, even with two people who philosophically share the same idea that men and women should be equal? Is that even possible? So that gives you a sense, hopefully, of Lucy Stone, the time period that that she grew up in, and a little more about the book. So what I thought I would do, and then I really want to open it up to questions, because even though we're not live on screen together, definitely please write in your questions in the chat function if there's anything that you want to know, either about Lucy Stone or the writing process. Happy to answer any of them. So we'll get to those in a minute. But being that I'm sitting in this beautiful parlor in the Sargent House, I just want to spend a minute talking about the really uncanny similarities between Judith Sargent Murray and Lucy Stone. So Judith Sargent Murray, for those who aren't familiar with her, she was born a full almost 70 years before Lucy Stone. In fact, she dies 2 years before Lucy Stone is even born. So when I think about Lucy Stone as being well ahead of her time, well, Judith Sargent was even that much more ahead of her time. But they believed in the exact same things. And Judith Sargent wrote a lot about the fact that women should be and are the absolute equal of men. She wrote specifically about the fact that women should have their own control of their own financial situation. She believed that the requirement for women to own all the domestic tasks was just a self-fulfilling prophecy, that sticking women in that role meant that they learned no other roles. And so when men would say, oh, see, you know, you don't understand science, it's because they were never given the opportunity. So they were very simpatico in their philosophies. And I think the thing, though, that struck me the most that they have in common is their belief in the power of education. So I think, as I mentioned, even when Lucy was growing up, it wasn't really normal for women to be educated beyond the 8th grade. The belief was all you had to learn as a woman was just enough reading and just enough math to read to your children and keep the household counts. And both Judith and Lucy thought that that was ludicrous. Now, they came to this belief in very different ways. So Judith Sargent was raised in a wealthy household, so she had access to her father's entire library. So she read lots and lots of books and understood that there was more. Lucy had no books. There were no books in her house, literally, other than the Bible. And the only other reading material was The Liberator, which, as you can see from her story, hearing what it was like for enslaved people in our country made her realize that this was a cause she wanted to follow. But she had no access to any other reading materials outside of school. Even novels were forbidden in her house. But they had one thing in common, which were brothers, which I find really interesting. So Judith Sargent will say that her brothers had all the best tutors, and she was actually allowed a tutor, which was pretty great at that time, but she considered them the inferior tutors because nobody really thought her education was important, and that infuriated her. Lucy had older brothers who she adored. She was much younger than they were, and she saw them go off to college because her father was a huge believer in college and in education and kept preaching to his boys the need for an education and the value of an education. So Lucy's thinking to herself, fabulous, I can't wait till it's my turn. And, you know, she gets 8th grade and her father says, what are you talking about? There's no more education for you. So they came to it from different ways, but they were both extremely adamant about the importance for education. And in fact, they both turned their houses into places to educate young girls, both of them either adopting or having friends and cousins and nieces come and often be homeschooled or tutored. Both of these women did that themselves because they just knew that this was the key to the future for women. So I just wanted to share with you a quotation from an essay that Judith Sargent Murray wrote in 1790, and then read just a short bit from my book so you can get a sense what it's like and also understand how much these two women have in common, which I think is really interesting. So what I'm going to read to you from Judith Sargent was from an essay she wrote called On the Equality of the Sexes, published in 1790. So this was the year before Mary Wollstonecraft published her famous essay, which is quite extraordinary. So here's what she says. It may be questioned, she's talking about that men assume their superiority. So she says, yet it may be questioned from what doth this superiority in this determining faculty of the soul proceed? May we not trace its source in the difference of education and continued advantages? Will it be said that the judgment of a male of 2 years old is more sage than of a female of the same age? I believe the reverse is generally observed to be true. All your mothers out there can probably concur with that. But from that period, what partiality? How is the one exalted and the other depressed? By the contrary modes of education which are adopted. The one is taught to aspire, and the other is early confined and limited. As their years increase, the sister must be wholly domesticated, while the brother is led by the hand through all the flowery paths of science. Grant that their minds are by nature equal, yet who shall wonder at the apparent superiority, if indeed custom becomes second nature, nay, if it taketh place of nature, and that it doth the experience of each day will evince. At length arrived at womanhood, the uncultivated fair one feels a void, which the employments allotted her are by no means capable of filling. Pretty good argument, right? You know, you keep telling them that they're not worthy, you don't give them education, how can they possibly be worthy? So what I thought I'd do is read just a short section from the beginning of my book, not only so you'll see the similarities between these two extraordinary women, but also to give you a sense of the book. So this is from the opening chapter. The chapter actually, the book opens very near the end of Lucy Stone's life, when she is speaking at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. So she is there. There's a mention of someone named Alice who is there with her. And I'll just read this short passage and then we can go to some questions. We find the women's pavilion among the acres of exhibits, canals, and attractions of the fair and enter the auditorium through the door behind the stage. When Alice parts the curtain, the applause rushes at us, and I wonder for a moment if we have interrupted someone else's remarks. She cups my elbow and guides me to the dais. Hundreds of people fill the seats, their smooth faces looking up at me. This is what will make the 1,000 rattling miles from Boston to Chicago worth it. My body is too much of a burden for that kind of travel anymore. I scan the audience until I find my touchstone. I've always done this, picked out one person in the room to use as a bellwether for how my message is being received. I'm not used to having so many friendly faces to choose from. In the early days, I would often have to utilize a snarling bearded man as my measuring stick, but even that would suffice. Today, I find a young woman about 10 rows back who looks quite a bit like I did in my youth. She is petite with thick brown hair pulled neatly off her face, and her smile accentuates pleasantly rounded cheeks. She even has my bright gray eyes. I decide to name her Hope. Hope unfolds and refolds a handkerchief in her lap. She is anxious for me to begin, is perhaps even worried that I will falter. I owe her the talk she came to hear. I grip the podium, scan my notes, and speak. 3 years, even before the last 50, marks the beginning of true progress, when the opening of a door, the door to education. When the first college in this country decided to allow women, it finally gave our sex access to the tree of knowledge, to a root system that could nourish our starving minds. I remind Hope that once the spread of truth and knowledge began, it could not be stopped. Professional barriers were the next to fall. I tell her of my great friend Nettie, who was the first female to be ordained as a Protestant minister, and Elizabeth Blackwell, the first female doctor licensed in the country. Hope is smiling and nodding. She is with me now. That's when I see her, sitting in the front row of the balcony. How did I not notice her bright red shawl and wire-rimmed glasses earlier? Susan B. Anthony, as thin and prim as ever, her power undiminished by her years. Once my dear friend and most trusted ally, here she is, listening to me speak of our shared history, of the accomplishments we worked so hard together to achieve. It's kind of her to be here, but I cannot deny that the old anger still rankles, and I work hard to keep it out of my voice. I don't want her to know that I see her. I understood from the beginning that fighting for women's rights would not be easy work, that my own version of right and wrong would cost me friends, but never did I expect to lose this friend. Over breakfast, I read in the morning paper an article entitled, Ms. Anthony Charms in Chicago. According to the article, Susan was well received here yesterday and gracious in her remarks. She passed the credit for the founding of our great women's movement on to 4 women, putting my name on a list that didn't include her own. We've learned to be good to each other in public, and yet we've never been able to forgive each other. And how extraordinary, really, that neither of us is likely to survive long enough to walk into a booth and cast a proper vote. That will be a bitter pill for her. It is everything to her. Hope's gaze implores me to go on. I summon a stream of words, coaxing them to flow through the auditorium. I will admit that I was blessed with a voice for this work. With a little practice, it's easy to speak loudly enough to those in the back row, so those in the back row don't have to strain to hear. Doing so while not overwhelming the front row is the trick. No one likes a woman who yells. But they say I was born with a voice like a babbling brook, soothing to hear even as it cuts a new path into the silt of an unsuspecting mind. I close my remarks with my most deeply held belief that what we need most of all to continue our progress is to speak the truth fearlessly. Where I found that courage at such a young age, I don't know. But as Susan once said, it is not bravery when you know you're right. I look up to her before I can stop myself, and she tips her head at me. An entreaty to mend what divides us? Alice is at my side then, steadying me against the sudden explosion of applause. Hope is on her feet, as is everyone around her. Tears rush down her cheeks and drip into her bright smile. A familiar joy swells in my heart, the sense that maybe I have changed one mind, moved one detractor, made one woman's place at her own dining table a more respected seat. That is all I have ever wanted. I look into the balcony again to share the moment with Susan, but she is already gone. That, the little piece of Leaving Coy's Hill. So I think we have at least a couple of questions.
Teresa wants to know, what does the title mean?
The title. Very good question. So Coy's Hill is actually the property on which Lucy grew up. And as a side note, it is a trustees of reservations property in West Brookfield, so you can go there to visit it. And it was just put on the National Registry as an historic place just this past June, so that's exciting. But Coy's Hill was very, very special to Lucy in many ways, not only because her family was from there, but it brought her very close to nature. And she carried a lot of what she learned from Coy's Hill with her, but there was also a lot that she had to leave behind. So I mentioned that her father was a great abolitionist. So she really got her fight from her father. She understood that fighting against the popular belief was still something you needed to do when you believed yourself to be right, or fighting for the right thing. But her father, as I've also said, was dead against his daughter getting an education. And he never really quite accepted the idea of her speaking in public, even though it was on the cause he held most dear. So to me, a lot of this book is about kind of what we take with us from our childhood and what we need to leave behind.
We also have a question that asks, why did you decide to write this story as a novel instead of a biography?
Yes, very good question. So there are a couple of biographies written about Lucy Stone. I would consider them more academic biographies, I guess. I did consider writing this as nonfiction, but there were a few key reasons why I didn't. The first is that, as I mentioned earlier, it's written in the, or as you heard, it's written in the first person point of view. And I really wanted to explore what it would feel like to be her. What was going through her mind when she was standing on stage? You know, was she afraid? How did certain things really affect her at an emotional level? So those were things that I could only imagine. I couldn't present them as fact. I also really wanted to be able to bring scenes alive. When I was reading stories of her life, I kept reading snippets about things that struck me as really important and interesting scenes. So I wanted to bring the dialogue to life. You know, I have scenes where Lucy Stone and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are sitting around a table debating which of all the wrongs against women they should be fighting for at the next women's convention. What should their position on certain issues be? And I thought those conversations would be really fun to write and hopefully to read. And I wanted to bring those scenes alive. And so I had to use fiction. The last thing I would say is that Lucy has such an extraordinary life, but I couldn't tell all of it. So I had to focus my story on the parts of the story that I found most compelling about her life. And so that meant that I had to, you know, telescope time a little bit. I played with geography a little bit. So, you know, while all the major events in the book are things that are true, I did want the license to, you know, make the story flow, make sure that it was really as interesting and compelling a reading experience as it could be. So felt that I needed fiction to do that.
Patricia wants to know, when did the first women's colleges open?
Ooh, this is a very good question. So I may get this date slightly wrong. I want to say that Oberlin was the first to accept both women and blacks, actually, which is very exciting. And I want to say that they decided to accept women in around 1830 or 1835. Mount Holyoke College had started by then. Actually Lucy attended it for a while. It was a little bit of a cross of like a preparatory school. It took a while to move into the full-fledged college as we think of it today. So it was around that time frame. So it probably took until Lucy was 16 or 18 until she could even really consider going to college.
Carol wants to know, what role did religion play in either woman's life?
Oh, this is a very good question. So I'm not an expert on Judith Sargent Murray, so you'll forgive me that my answer on her will be a little thin, except that her second husband was a minister, I believe, and they met sort of exchanging ideas on sort of the philosophy of religion. For Lucy, the church was a difficult place for her. So when she was a teenager was when the famous Grimke sisters, two of her idols also, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, they actually spoke at the Massachusetts State House on behalf of the idea of women's rights. It was their first and last speech, and they were actually expelled from the church for it. And so Lucy went to a church service and heard what was called the pastoral letter, where all the pastors of all the churches read out this incredible letter about how women speaking out made them unnatural beings and how these women had to be kicked out of the church. So Lucy did not have a lot of fondness for the church. Now, interestingly, her best friend, Nettie Brown, who I mentioned in the reading, her dream is to be the first ordained female minister. So it was quite interesting because Lucy was full on in supporting her in living out this dream and doing what women weren't supposed to do. But she really tried to talk Nettie out of it and say, can't we put your skills to use in something better than the church? So it was a complicated relationship for sure.
Gordon would like you to speculate on the difference that it made that Judith, unlike Lucy, did not start off in an egalitarian marriage. Judith's first husband left Judith deeply in debt and appeared not to have treated Judith as an equal. Fortunately, her second marriage was to a longtime friend who clearly respected her. So could you speculate on the difference that it made that Judith, unlike Lucy, didn't start off in an egalitarian marriage?
Well, a big difference is, in my understanding, Judith married her first husband when she was rather young, or of the normal marrying age. And so I'm sure that had a huge impact on her, that she was sort of living the inequality that Lucy only sort of saw on a philosophical level. Lucy, by the time that Henry Blackwell shows up on her doorstep and proposes marriage, she was already 35 years old. So she had, was college educated and already had a long-standing career as a lecturer, and actually had made quite a bit of money by that time. So she already had this entire life that she had built as an independent woman. So the struggle for her was, would a marriage change that or not? And would she be giving any of that up if she got married? And then the book explores, what was that really like? And so I think some of what Lucy feared, happens to a woman in terms of, feeling obligated to then all of a sudden keep the house clean, things like that, cook for the husband, which she never had to do before. These were new to her, but she found that culturally it was hard to give those things up. So I think they came at marriage from very different viewpoints, and I think it made it difficult on Lucy's marriage because They both had extraordinarily high expectations of what it might look like, but they both had difficulty in many ways in living up to what sounded good on paper. So it was a very, very interesting relationship to explore.
We have a question about what brought about the division between Lucy Stone and Susan B. Anthony.
Yes, so I will fill you in a little bit about that. The division was around the 15th Amendment, which in 1869, so this is just after emancipation, the 15th Amendment was written to give Black men the vote before women. And leading up to that time, if you remember the picture of the petition that I showed you, that was a petition for universal rights, which a group called the American Equal Rights Association had been fighting for. So this was suffrage for everybody. But it seemed that there wasn't, the Congress didn't have the will at the moment to pass all of it. So the sense was there was more momentum at the time for giving the vote to Black men. But there was a feeling that the AERA, which had a lot of influence, so again, we're talking about people like Lucy Stone and Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Anderson, they're all part of this group, that they wanted to present a united front on the matter. And the Women's Caucus, who fully made up half of the AERA and did a lion's share of its work, they really wanted the Women's Caucus to have a united front on this and come out in support of the 15th Amendment. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were having none of it and felt that if women were not given the vote at that moment, they would be left behind for decades, and came up with an alternate proposal, which was educated suffrage, which basically said, let's take sex and race out of it. Let's just say you have to be educated to get the vote, which was an extraordinarily racist idea because learning to read was verboten on plantations. So there were almost no Blacks that knew how to read. And there were actually, and lower class women weren't educated either. So it was a very sort of classist, racist direction. But they wanted Lucy to support them. And Lucy couldn't stand with them in public. And so she publicly broke from them. And Susan B. Anthony never forgave her for that. And the women's movement literally split into two competing organizations.
We have a comment from Leslie who says that listening to you talk about your book makes me think about the similarities between life in America in the 1800s and what's going on in Afghanistan for women there.
Yeah, one thing that I continually hear about this book is how relevant it is. I think you're absolutely right. It's completely relevant for what's going on with women in Afghanistan. It's also still really relevant for what's going on in our own country. When you think about the racial reckoning that we've been through, you look at what's happening in Texas right now with abortion rights. When I said that married women at this time lost all their rights, they also lost the right to their own body. There was no crime of rape by a husband of his wife. It was considered the woman's duty to make herself available to her husband at his wishes. So this idea of women owning their own bodies in every way, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of the first to say birth control is important. All of these issues that are now threatened are issues that these women were the first to talk about. And what you see what's happening in Afghanistan, and it's interesting, right? Education is also a big part of it. Not wanting Afghani women to be educated and making sure that they strip them of all their rights. And it's horrifying. And what I find inspiring about stories like Lucy's, which is why I chose to spend 3 to 5 years of my life with her, is remembering what an extraordinary difference one person can make or a group of people can make when they really stand up for what they believe. So, sometimes we can take for granted the changes that have happened since the Civil War, even that the North won the Civil War, that emancipation ever happened, that women ever gained suffrage. Sometimes you say, oh, of course that was going to happen that way. But you realize that it only happened because of the hard work of individuals who are devoted to that cause. And so, you know, let's hope that that work continues all around the world, because there's so much of it still to be done.
We have a couple questions about the writing process.
Sure.
So we have a question. Is this your first book that you have written?
It is not. This is my third book. So my first book was a family memoir about my parents. They had a turbulent love affair. So I wanted to get that down for the record. It's a great story. It's called Finding Home. And then I published my first novel in 2016. That's called Fill the Sky. And that's a contemporary novel, which is about 3 longtime friends who travel to Ecuador together to see if the shamans and healers down there can save one of them from cancer.
We also have a question. How long did it take you to write Leaving Coy's Hill? And could you talk about your research?
Sure. So I read about Lucy Stone and her time and her colleagues for about a year before I even started to write. So this involved some biographies, as I mentioned, that I read, and then as much primary material as I could get. So I mentioned the Liberator as a newspaper. A lot of those issues are digitized, so I was able to actually read them. Other newspapers of the time. One of my most important research tools were troves of letters that I was able to read. There's a whole compendium of letters between Lucy and her best friend Nettie, and then another compendium of letters between Lucy and Henry. So that really helped me understand both sort of what was considered ordinary and extraordinary in the day based on what they remarked on and what they didn't, but also how they thought, how they felt, how they even spoke, even how she phrases her words. So that was really important research. So I did all that reading and sort of mapped out her life and a lot of the scenes and moments that I thought might be interesting. And then had to sort of stand back and figure out what story I wanted to tell. The writing process itself, once I finally decided, okay, I've learned enough for now, let's close the books and write the story. It probably took me about, between first draft and revision, about 2 years. So the first draft was about 9 months, and then it took another year plus to sort of revise it, make changes, further research things that I felt needed a little more detail, and get feedback and make changes. So about a 3-year process altogether.
Speaking of the letters, are the letters in the book actual, or are they the synthesis of your research?
Yes, the letters in the book I actually wrote myself. Even though I read so many letters, I didn't cut and paste, if you will, any of them into the book for a couple of reasons. One is I just didn't feel right doing that. But also, more to the point, the letters in the book needed to fit in with the given plot. And so I kind of had to merge ideas and, you know, and make them fit into the plot. Also, I will tell you that many letters of the day were really, really long and really detailed. So lots of things that you would need to know. So I chose to write them myself. Similarly, all the speeches in the book that Lucy gives, I wrote myself. She was famous for never writing down her speeches, so most of them are lost. There are a couple that were captured because a reporter diligently wrote them down, but most of them are lost forever, so I had to invent those also.
We have 2 questions that go hand in hand. Early on, Susan seems a bit resentful of Lucy getting married and then of her having a child. How much do you think that may have played into the rift? And could you say a few words about Lucy and Henry's daughter?
Yes. So sounds like someone who's read the book. Yay. So yes, so when Lucy and Susan meet, Lucy is not yet married, And they bond a bit over the fact that they both know that marriage is not for them. They have too much work to do. They're too busy. Who has time? Elizabeth Cady Stanton, on the other hand, you may know, is married and has, I think she has 8 children. And that really does keep her to the house a lot. So she's busy writing, but it's Lucy and Susan B. Anthony that are out on the road constantly speaking. And so it's almost as if they've made this promise to each other that they're not going to get married. So Susan saw it as sort of a bit of folly, you know, so what is this? You have a crush on somebody, or like, get over it, we have work to do. And then on top of it, Susan just saw, she even saw in Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was her other closest friend, she understood the obligations of motherhood. And so she just had this strong feeling that once a woman has a child, then they're bound by that. And that her biggest worry was if Lucy had a child, that she would lose her forever to the cause. And they really relied on each other as you know, 2 women who were really working at a level that was kind of unheard of. So they were really sort of 2 of a kind. And so I do think that was the beginning of a rift between them, of sort of you know, frustration, I guess, that Susan B. Anthony had with Lucy, that she would, you know, bother. How could she possibly put anything above the importance of the work that they were doing? And Lucy never really meant to prioritize one over the other. I think she was just curious to see if she could do both, you know, as so many of us are. And it's still the age-old question, you know, can you do it all? So Lucy was one of the first to try.
We have another question about the writing process. What is the best piece of writing advice you received that you still use in your writing?
This is a great question. And the answer to me, I received a piece of advice that changed my entire writing life. So I was a business person before I became a writer, and I decided I was going to approach writing like a job. So to me, that meant 5 days a week, I'm heads down, and then I do have a family, husband and children. And so working in business also meant to me that on the weekends I turned it off. And so I could be present at home. And I found that I started dreading weekends, and Mondays were my worst writing days, even though I was so excited to get back to the work. And there was a piece of advice. It was a speech by Walter Mosley. I don't know if you know him. He's an extremely prolific and acclaimed writer who's put out, I don't even know how many books, it's hard to keep track of. And someone asked him how he did it. And he said the key is, if you're in a project, to write every day, 7 days a week, do not take a day off, because art and stories come from the subconscious. And his feeling is that it takes days and days and days to get into the subconscious, to the place where you're accessing that art. It takes about 2 days to get out of it. And I don't think he picked 2 days as a random thought, right? That's about a weekend. So when you take the days off, then you're spending all your time trying to get back into the story. So from the minute I heard that, it was like a light bulb going off. And since that moment, if I am deep into a project, which to me means drafting or deep in revision, I'm working 7 days a week. That doesn't mean that I'm working 8 hours 7 days a week, but I have to do, even if I have house guests and it's 20 minutes, hopefully it's at least an hour on the weekends, or, you know, when there's a lot going on, but it has to be 7 days a week. And that has changed everything. The work got so much better and so much more efficient.
Do you have another book in mind to write?
Yes, I have another draft written, actually. And I, before coming here, I came from meeting with one of the members of my writing group who's just read it and was giving me feedback. So that book is set to be revised now, and hopefully we'll get out in the world before too long.
We also have a question, where is your book available to purchase?
Yes, my book is available wherever books are sold. Beautiful Gloucester bookstore straight across the street. from where I am sitting carries the book. Any independent bookstore, if they don't carry it, you can ask for it and they can order it for you. It's also on Amazon. There is there's an audio recording of the book, so you can get that off Audible, or I recommend Libro.fm if you like audiobooks, because you can pick an independent bookstore to send the revenues to. It's also on Kindle, so pretty much anywhere you would buy any other book.
And I think we have time for one more question or a couple more questions.
Okay.
Gordon wants to know, do you visit Judith's writing space if you haven't done so already?
Judith's writing space. So I live in Cohasset, which is the other coast. So I don't get up this way very often, but I will tell you, when I took a tour of this house, that of course was the spot that immediately stood out to me, and I just wanted to sit down and stay there and say, okay, tour can continue, I'm going to stay here. So I loved that she had that, and that she was quite an extraordinary writer and playwright. So not just essays, but creative work also. So I would love to be able to come and write there, but I can't say that I do. Do we have time for one more, maybe? One more.
Yes, we have time for one more. And Kylie wants to know, in what way has your life changed having spent so much time in another woman's life?
Wow, that's very interesting. I would say in general, my research for this book has shown me kind of the process and difficulty of change, I guess. So seeing the turbulence that our country has gone through, it was both, as I think I said before, comforting to be in this time, pre-Civil War, and know that we've gotten through it. And it's also a little disheartening that we're still where we are, but I feel like I had a much deeper understanding of where these things come from. So Lucy in particular, I'll say one thing. Lucy wasn't judgmental about men who didn't see women as their equals, or even women who didn't believe that they belonged outside the domestic sphere. She knew that this was how it was, this was how they were brought up, so she didn't blame them for that. And so I think I actually look at things a little bit differently, even though I will speak my mind about it, but when I see certain cultural norms that bother me, kind of about how some men regard women, maybe even the professional realm, I remind myself that this is how this country was built, and it doesn't make it right. It means that this is the culture that's been passed down, passed down, passed down, and so we have to be really, really intentional in being careful not to just pass things down as the way they are, otherwise things will never change. So I guess it's just given me a much longer view on things, and hopefully maybe a little more intentional going forward.
We do have one more question from Jackie, who wants to know, can you talk about GrubStreet for other writers?
Oh yes, thank you, Jackie, for that question. So for anyone who doesn't know, GrubStreet is a creative writing center that's headquartered in Boston and offers classes, whether it's an hour-long seminar to 10-week-long workshops on it's all creative writing, essay writing, any genre you can imagine. Even if you want to find an agent or want to know how to get published, GrubStreet has classes on everything. I'm the chair of the board, which is why I think this question was asked. And we have a brand new home on the waterfront in Boston, which is beautiful and is going to open as soon as COVID allows. But all of our classes have been moved to Zoom, which is great. So you can take them from wherever you are, and that's not going to stop. So if you have any interest in writing, and I should say also our classes are for every level. So we have classes for people who have never even written a sentence of a story to master novelists. So wherever you are in the process and any genre, you can check out grubstreet.org and see if there's something for you. So I think we should probably wrap it up, so we don't keep you all much longer, but thank you for all your wonderful questions. That was really fantastic. And thank you for spending the time with me. And I just really want to thank the Sargent House for having me. It's a spectacular place. If you haven't visited yet, you must. And if you like what you've heard tonight, please contribute to the Sargent House. Funds are always needed to keep a beautiful place like this going and to hold events like this one. And you can, if you want to know more or contact me, I do have an author website, which is kasherbrook.com. So check that out and get in touch if you'd like to know more. Thanks so much.
Thank you. We're so happy that you're here for this wonderful presentation. We have lots of thanks coming in from our audience. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you.